The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on December 14th, 1962, and I knew that if I answered it, an innocent man would go to prison. If I didn't, he'd go to prison anyway, but I wouldn't have to be the one who sealed his fate. I let it ring. The man's name was Samuel Torres, and 30 years later, I'm finally ready to tell you why he died in Folsom State Prison, believing that nobody cared enough about the truth to speak it. I was 25, living in Los Angeles, working as a researcher for a private investigator named Harold Grimm. It was 1962, and Hollywood was changing, but the old networks of corruption that ran the city were still intact. Grimm specialized in digging up information for studio executives, lawyers, and politicians who needed problems to disappear quietly. The job paid well and offered something I desperately needed: access to the kind of people who could advance my acting career. Grimm's clients included casting directors, talent agents, and producers. All I had to do was research their problems, compile evidence, and keep my mouth shut about what I learned. The case that would haunt me for 3 decades started in November 1962, when Grimm was hired by a man named Charles Brennan. Brennan was a successful construction contractor who'd built half the shopping centers in Orange County. He was also being investigated for tax evasion, bid rigging, and using undocumented workers on government contracts. Federal investigators had been building a case against Brennan for 2 years, but they needed someone on the inside to provide evidence of his illegal activities. That's where Samuel Torres came in. Sam was a 34-year-old bookkeeper who'd been working for Brennan Construction for 6 years. He was methodical, honest, and had access to all the financial records that could prove Brennan's crimes. More importantly, Sam had a sick daughter who needed expensive medical treatment, and the FBI had offered him immunity and a reward if he testified against his employer. Brennan discovered Sam's cooperation through a contact in the DA's office. Instead of confronting him directly, Brennan decided to destroy him. My job was to find evidence that Sam Torres was embezzling from the company. Brennan wanted him discredited before he could testify, his reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no jury would believe his accusations. It took me 3 weeks to realize that no such evidence existed, because Sam Torres had never stolen a penny from anyone in his life. When I reported that Sam was clean, Brennan wasn't satisfied. "Look harder," he told me. "Everyone's got something to hide, find it." But Harold Grimm had a different approach. If we couldn't find evidence of Sam's guilt, we'd create it. Grimm had done this before: plant forged documents in a target's files, create false bank records showing unexplained deposits, manufacture a paper trail that would convince investigators they'd found genuine evidence of wrongdoing. "It's simple," Grimm explained. "We slip some altered invoices into Torres's files, make it look like he's been approving payments to non-existent subcontractors and pocketing the money. The FBI finds the documents during their investigation, and suddenly their star witness becomes just another crook trying to save his own skin." The plan was elegant and devastating. The forged documents would be discovered during a legitimate federal search, making them appear authentic. Sam would be arrested for embezzlement before he could testify against Brennan. His credibility destroyed, the tax evasion case would collapse. I spent 2 weeks creating the false evidence: altered invoices, fake purchase orders, counterfeit bank statements. I was good at it. Meticulous, careful, creating documents that would fool investigators who weren't expecting deception. The night of December 14th, everything was ready. The forged papers were prepared. The plan was to plant them in Sam's office files the next morning, then tip off the FBI about suspicious financial irregularities in the company's books. All I had to do was deliver the documents to Grimm's office and let the destruction of Samuel Torres proceed on schedule. That's when my conscience made one last attempt to save itself. At 11:30 p.m., I was in my apartment holding a manila envelope containing evidence that would send an innocent man to prison for crimes he didn't commit. I had created every piece of that evidence myself, knowing it was false, knowing what it would do to Sam's life. I thought about calling Grimm to tell him I couldn't go through with it. I thought about warning Sam that he was being framed. I thought about taking the evidence to the FBI and exposing the entire conspiracy. I thought about a lot of things. Instead, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and waited for the phone to ring. When it did, at 11:47 p.m., I knew it was Grimm calling to confirm that everything was ready for the next morning, that the evidence was prepared, that I was committed to following through. Answering that phone meant confirming my participation in the frame-up. It meant becoming fully complicit in the destruction of Samuel Torres. Not answering meant that Grimm would assume I'd gotten cold feet, that I was unreliable, that I couldn't be trusted with the kind of work that kept me close to Hollywood power brokers. I let it ring 16 times before it stopped. 20 minutes later, it rang again. I let it ring until it stopped. At 12:23 a.m., it rang a third time. This time, I answered. "It's done," I told Grimm. "Everything's ready." The frame-up proceeded exactly as planned. The forged documents were planted in Sam's files on December 15th. An anonymous tip led FBI investigators to discover them on December 18th. Sam Torres was arrested for embezzlement on December 20th. The evidence against him was overwhelming and apparently authentic. Financial records showing a pattern of theft going back 18 months, bank statements proving unexplained deposits to accounts in his name, invoices for work that had never been performed. Sam maintained his innocence, but innocence is hard to prove when the evidence against you has been carefully crafted by professionals. His lawyer recommended a plea bargain. 5 years in prison instead of 20, if Sam admitted guilt and agreed not to testify against Charles Brennan. Sam refused. He insisted on a trial, convinced that the truth would come out, that someone would realize the evidence had been fabricated. The trial lasted 8 days. I attended every session, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching Sam Torres fight for his reputation while I carried the knowledge that could have saved him. Sam's defense was that he'd been framed by his employer to prevent him from testifying in the federal investigation. But without proof of the conspiracy, without someone willing to testify about the forged documents, his claims sounded like the desperate accusations of a guilty man. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. Samuel Torres was sentenced to 12 years in Folsom State Prison. Charles Brennan was never prosecuted. With his primary witness discredited, the federal investigation collapsed. Brennan Construction continued operating, continued cheating on government contracts, continued exploiting workers who couldn't defend themselves. And I continued working for Harold Grimm, using the connections from that job to eventually land my first movie role. Sam Torres served 7 years in prison before dying of a heart attack at age 41. His daughter, the one who'd needed expensive medical treatment, died while he was incarcerated. His wife divorced him and moved back to Texas with their surviving children. I learned all this in 1985, 23 years after his conviction, when guilt finally drove me to hire a private investigator to find out what had happened to the man I'd helped destroy. By then, I was successful enough to hire the best investigators, wealthy enough to fund thorough research, influential enough to open doors that had been closed to Sam Torres during his fight for justice. The investigator's report was devastating in its thoroughness. Sam had died still maintaining his innocence, still claiming he'd been framed by his employer, still believing that somewhere there was evidence that could clear his name. His children had grown up believing their father was a criminal. His wife had spent 16 years raising kids alone while carrying the shame of being married to a convicted embezzler. The Torres family had been destroyed, not just by Sam's imprisonment, but by the reputation that followed them afterward. Neighbors who whispered, teachers who watched the children more carefully, employers who found reasons not to hire Sam's wife. 3 lives ruined, 1 life ended, a family scattered, all because I'd been too afraid to risk my career by telling the truth. But the worst detail in that report, the one that has kept me awake for the last 7 years, was what Sam had told his cellmate during his final months. The evidence was fake, Sam had said. Someone created it to frame me. Whoever did it, they know the truth. Someday, maybe when they're old enough to have a conscience, they'll come forward and tell people what really happened. Samuel Torres died waiting for me to find the courage I should have had when I was 25. In 1987, I contacted Sam's son, Miguel, who was then 32, and working as a mechanic in Houston. I told him I'd known his father, that I had information about his case, that there were things about his conviction that weren't what they seemed. Miguel agreed to meet me, but he was skeptical. He'd grown up with people promising they could clear his father's name, usually for money he didn't have. We met at a coffee shop near his garage on a hot afternoon in July. Miguel had his father's dark eyes and careful way of speaking, but there was a wariness in him that Sam had never possessed. I told him everything. About working for Harold Grimm, about the plan to frame his father, about the forged evidence I'd created, about the phone call I'd answered when I should have hung up, the choice I'd made that destroyed his family. Miguel listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification, taking notes in a small notebook like his father used to carry. When I finished, Miguel was quiet for several minutes. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. "Because your father deserved better, because your family deserved the truth." 25 years too late. Yes. Miguel closed his notebook and looked at me with an expression I recognized from the courtroom in 1962, the same dignity his father had shown while fighting accusations he couldn't disprove. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. I want to give you something, proof of what really happened, evidence that your father was innocent." I'd brought copies of everything, my original research notes showing Sam was clean, Harold Grimm's correspondence about the frame-up, even samples of my handwriting from the forged documents. Everything needed to prove the conspiracy that had destroyed his father. Miguel studied the papers for a long time. "This could clear his name," he said. "It should have cleared his name 25 years ago." Miguel Torres spent 2 years working with a legal aid organization that specialized in posthumous exonerations. In 1990, 28 years after his conviction, Samuel Torres was officially cleared of all charges. The California State Bar launched an investigation into Harold Grimm's activities, discovering a pattern of evidence fabrication going back decades. Grimm lost his license and was prosecuted for conspiracy and fraud, though by then he was 73 and served only 18 months in prison. Charles Brennan had died in 1983, taking his secrets to the grave. But federal investigators reopened their case against Brennan Construction, using Sam's original evidence to prosecute the company's surviving executives. Miguel established the Samuel Torres Memorial Fund for wrongfully convicted persons, using money I provided to help families fight for posthumous exonerations and support people rebuilding their lives after false imprisonment. The fund's first client was a woman named Maria Santos, who'd been convicted of fraud in 1978 based on forged documents created by a corrupt insurance investigator. Maria had served 12 years before DNA evidence proved her innocence, but she'd spent another 8 years trying to clear her record and rebuild her reputation. Miguel told me that his father would have wanted to help people like Maria, would have understood what it meant to be betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect the innocent. Dad always said that good people would eventually overcome the damage caused by those who choose to stay silent, Miguel said at the fund's dedication ceremony. It took 28 years, but he was right. I'm 54 years old now. I've spent the last 27 years of my life trying to earn the right to call myself the kind of person Samuel Torres believed I could become. I've used my success to support causes that fight injustice, to help people who've been wrongfully accused, to ensure that other families don't suffer what the Torres family endured. But I can't undo the choice I made on December 14th, 1962. I can't give Sam back the 7 years he lost, or restore the reputation that was destroyed, or return the family that was scattered. All I can do is make sure that his story is remembered correctly, that his children know their shame was built on lies, that his name is associated with justice rather than guilt. And I can tell you that silence is the most deliberate choice you'll ever make. When you witness injustice and say nothing, you become part of the injustice. When you protect your own future by destroying someone else's present, you become complicit in that destruction. Samuel Torres was an innocent man who deserved better from everyone who knew the truth but chose to stay quiet. He deserved better from me. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on December 14th, 1962. I answered it, and an innocent man went to prison. That was 30 years ago. I was 25 then, afraid that telling the truth would cost me my future. I'm 54 now, and I've learned that some truths become more important with age, not less. That middle age is the last moment when telling the truth can still change something, even if it can't change the past. This is that moment. This is that truth. My name is Robert Redford, and I helped send an innocent man to prison because I was more afraid of losing my career than he was of losing his life. Samuel Torres died waiting for me to find the courage to speak. I finally found it. 28 years too late for him, but maybe just in time for someone else who needs to hear that silence is always a choice, and that it's never too late to choose differently. The weight of that phone call has never left me. Every success I've achieved, every role I've played, every cause I've championed, all of it has been colored by the knowledge that I once chose my comfort over another man's life. But I've also learned that guilt can be transformed into purpose, that the shame of past failures can become the foundation for future courage, that admitting you were wrong doesn't erase what happened, but it can prevent it from happening again. Samuel Torres was a good man who trusted the system to protect him. He believed that truth would prevail, that justice would be served, that someone with knowledge of his innocence would eventually speak up. He was wrong about the timing, but he was right about the principle. Truth does eventually surface. Justice can be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. The Samuel Torres Memorial Fund has helped exonerate 37 wrongfully convicted people over the past 2 years. 37 families who were able to clear their loved ones' names, to restore reputations that had been destroyed by corruption, to find some measure of peace in truth finally told. Each exoneration represents a small victory over the kind of silence that destroyed Sam's life. Each cleared name is proof that it's possible to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, justice over self-interest. Miguel Torres calls me every few months to update me on the fund's progress. He tells me about new cases, new families seeking help, new victories in the fight against wrongful conviction. He also tells me that he's forgiven me for what I did to his father, that he understands the fear that drove my choice even if he can't excuse it, that he believes his father would have forgiven me too because Sam always believed people could change, could grow, could become better than they were in their worst moments. That forgiveness doesn't erase my responsibility, but it makes carrying that responsibility bearable. It reminds me that redemption is possible, even for those of us who discovered our conscience decades too late. I can't speak for everyone who's listening to this story. I can't tell you what choices you should make, what risks you should take, what principles you should uphold, but I can tell you what I learned from answering that phone call on December 14th, 1962. I learned that silence is never neutral, that staying quiet in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice, that protecting your own future by allowing someone else's to be destroyed is a choice you'll carry for the rest of your life. I learned that middle age is indeed the last moment when truth can still change something meaningful. That confession delayed is not confession denied as long as you find the courage to speak before it's too late. I learned that some mistakes can be partially repaired, even if they can never be fully undone. That admitting guilt doesn't erase the damage you've caused, but it can prevent that damage from spreading further. Most importantly, I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, it's the decision to act, despite that fear. It's the choice to risk your comfort for someone else's justice, to sacrifice your convenience for another person's truth. Samuel Torres made that choice when he agreed to testify against Charles Brennan, knowing it would put his career and his freedom at risk. He chose courage over comfort, truth over safety. I made the opposite choice. I chose my career over his freedom, my future over his present, my comfort over his justice. I was 25 then, and I thought I had time to become a better person later. I thought I could make up for my cowardice with future acts of courage, my silence with eventual truth-telling. I was wrong about the timing, but I was right about the possibility. It took me 30 years, but I finally found the courage to speak the truth that could have saved Samuel Torres if I'd spoken it when it mattered. The phone is ringing for someone else now. Someone is facing their own moment of choice, their own decision between comfort and courage, their own opportunity to speak truth or choose silence. I can't answer that phone for them, but I can tell them what I learned from answering mine. Silence is always a choice, and it's never too late to choose differently, as long as you choose soon enough for it to matter. My name is Robert Redford. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on December 14th, 1962, and I made the wrong choice. This is my attempt to help someone else make a better one. The moment you choose silence, you become responsible for what happens next. The moment you choose to speak, you become responsible for making sure something better happens instead. Choose wisely. Choose soon. Choose while your choice can still save someone, because middle age really is the last moment when truth can change something besides your own conscience, and some silences once broken can still save lives. even if they can't save the lives that were lost while you were learning to speak.